The farmer was just digging a simple hole for a scarecrow when his shovel hit something that was never meant to be buried underground. From that moment on, his life changed forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from. The wind carried a thin, dry whistle across the empty cornfield, brushing through broken stalks that had already surrendered to the season. The harvest had come and gone, but the land still looked stripped and defeated, like something picked clean by time rather than machines. Eric Miller stood at the edge of the field with his hands in his pockets, staring out at the wide stretch of brown soil that had been part of his family's life for 4 generations. He knew every uneven dip in the earth, every stubborn patch where weeds had always grown thicker than the crop, every corner where his grandfather once said the soil held different memories. None of that mattered to the bank now. Land wasn't legacy to them, it was math. The letter still lay on the kitchen table inside the house, folded too neatly, as if that would make the words less sharp. Final notice. Balance overdue. Property subject to repossession. Due by the end of the month. The red ink date circled on the calendar matched the one printed in the letter. Like a countdown, he couldn't stop no matter how hard he worked the soil. Farming hadn't been good for years now. Drought, storms, bad prices, higher fuel costs. Too many things that were out of his control. Too many nights staring at the same ceiling, knowing that by the time spring came, he might not legally own the land he had been born on. So he was out here today, trying to do what little he could before winter made the ground too hard to work. He had built a new Scarecrow the night before. Nothing fancy, an old denim shirt, a flannel jacket stuffed tight with straw, a pair of gloves tied at the cuffs, and a weather-beaten hat that used to belong to his father. It wasn't meant to save the farm. It was meant to save the corn he still had, whatever small amount birds hadn't already taken. There was something silently humiliating about watching blackbirds peck at what already wasn't enough. He loaded the Scarecrow parts and a wooden post into the cart and pulled it across the field toward the far edge of the property, the corner he hadn't planted in years. The soil there was too stubborn, too full of stones, and bordered by a half-wild line of aspens that had crept in like the frontier wanted the land back. His father always said that part of the field didn't want to be farmed, and for decades no one tried to argue with it. But crows didn't care about unspoken farm superstitions, and right now, neither could he. Every bushel mattered. Every lost ear of corn was money he didn't have. When he reached the corner, the world felt quieter, as if even the wind didn't bother coming this far. Eric set the Scarecrow's clothing down on the ground, planted his boots firmly, lifted the post, and held it upright. The earth here was tougher and drier than the rest of the field, and he expected resistance, but when he brought the hammer down and drove the post a few inches, he heard something he had never heard in all his years farming. A sharp, muted clang. Not soil, not rock, not root. Metal. He paused, frowning. Maybe an old piece of equipment? Scrap left from before his time? He lifted the hammer again and pounded harder. The post jerked sideways, skidding off something solid beneath the dirt. The same sound rang again, not as loud but unmistakable, hollow, flat, and buried deep. Eric set the post aside and picked up his shovel. The fact that he felt a flicker of curiosity instead of impatience surprised him. He hadn't had space for curiosity in a long time. But curiosity had a way of waking up when something in the ground didn't belong there. He pressed his boot on the shovel and cut through the top layer of dirt, tossing clumps to the side. The soil was dense, with hard-packed clay beneath it, the kind that never seemed to dry even in drought. After a few minutes, he hit the shape again, not smooth like a pipe, not rounded like a boulder. A corner, a straight edge, something manufactured. He dug faster, carving out the perimeter. Sweat rolled down his back in spite of the cold. Inch by inch, the outline took form, a rectangular metal box, thick-walled, bigger than a toolbox but smaller than a trunk. The steel was eaten with rust, the hinges stiff and pitted, but it had weight behind it, weight that meant someone had put it there on purpose, not dropped it by accident. His first thought, ridiculous but immediate, was that maybe there was money inside. Maybe this was some old stash from a farmer who didn't trust banks. The thought was followed quickly by another. Or something bad. People didn't bury things in metal boxes for good reasons. He glanced around the field. No one was near, only one set of footprints, his own, leading from the house. If someone once meant this to be found, they hadn't told anyone before burying it. Eric bent down, gripped the box by the rim, and pried it loose from the clay. It came up slow, refusing to let go of the earth at first, then released with a sucking sound. He turned it over and saw the latch rusted but still intact. He lifted it, felt it resist, then break free with a gritty snap. The lid creaked open. Inside, wrapped in stale air and faint mold, lay a bundle of letters tied with string, a notebook with weathered edges, and several black and white photographs. Beneath those, folded documents, thick paper, stamped, handwritten, official-looking. And under all of it, tucked flat at the bottom, old newspaper clippings. Eric slowly lifted the top photograph. A farmhouse. A man standing in front of it, leaning against a fence, face half in shadow. On the back of the photo was a name written in faded ink. Walter Harper. And below that, a date from the late 70s. He picked up the next photo. The same man, different angle, standing with what looked like a delivery truck behind him. On the third photograph, he wasn't alone. There was a bank in the background, one Eric recognized from town. Only the sign was different because the photo was decades old. He reached for the notebook and opened to the last written page. The handwriting was uneven, like it had been written in a hurry. They said they'd come back. I hear trucks after dark. If anyone ever finds this, know I didn't take the money. I didn't run. I didn't sign anything. Beneath the words, a final line. If you found this, it means they finally buried me too. Eric stared at the page a long moment, feeling the cold through his gloves in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. He turned the notebook over and noticed something on the inside of the back cover. What looked like a rough sketch of a map, a marked line, a drawn boundary, a small X beside something labeled Old Aspen Line. He knew exactly what that meant. The Aspen Line was where he was standing. He looked over the papers again, bank statements, land deeds, letters addressed to Walter Harper. One document was a copy of a property transfer, stamped and sealed, showing the land Harper once owned had been sold after his disappearance. The signature on it looked jagged, uneasy, and at the bottom someone had written, "Witnessed under oath," though the witness field was blank. Eric felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't scrap metal or farm trash. This was a story someone tried to bury, someone who didn't get to finish telling it. And now he was the only person who knew it was here. The field around him suddenly felt different. Not just empty but watched in a way. As if the land had been holding on to a secret for decades, waiting for someone stubborn or desperate enough to dig in the only direction no one bothered anymore. Eric gathered the letters and documents, placed them carefully back inside the box, and closed the lid. He would take them home, dry them out, read them one by one. He didn't know yet why this mattered, or how, but something in his gut told him the truth buried out here was connected to something far bigger than an abandoned corner of a field. As he lifted the box and carried it toward the house, he looked back once at the half-dug earth, at the wooden post lying on its side, at the scarecrow parts still waiting to become a figure. The soil looked untouched again, but Eric now saw it differently, like a surface stretched thin over something else. The scarecrow could wait. The birds could wait. The farm could not wait. But this, whatever this was, felt like it could change everything if he understood it right. He didn't know yet that the box was only the first layer. that the Earth held more than one secret, that this discovery would lead him not just into the past, but into a silent conflict still alive in the present. He only knew he had dug one hole and found a question that didn't want to stay buried. And tomorrow, he would go back and keep digging. The next morning came gray and still, the air damp with the kind of mist that never quite turned into rain. Eric barely touched his coffee before pulling on his boots and heading out with the same quiet determination that had carried him through every harvest, every bad season. The box from yesterday sat on the kitchen table, cleaned of dirt and rust, its contents neatly spread across a towel to dry overnight. The notebook, the letters, the photographs. Each one had soaked up enough of his thoughts to keep him awake half the night. He'd read them twice, maybe 3 times, trying to make sense of what Walter Harper had left behind. The handwriting, the names, the unease in the words. It all felt too deliberate, too close to something that hadn't been meant to disappear. He took the notebook again and turned to the back cover. The rough sketch still stared up at him, a crooked line that looked like the old property border, the words "Old Aspen Line" scribbled in shaky script, and that simple X. Eric had been farming this land since he could remember, and if anyone in the county knew where that old Aspen Line was, it was him. He folded the map into his jacket pocket, grabbed a tape measure, a small hammer, and a handful of wooden stakes, and set out toward the far end of the field. The sky hung low as he trudged through the soft earth, the damp clinging to his jeans. When he reached the aspen grove, the trees stood like sentinels thin, pale trunks trembling in the wind. He placed the first stake near the spot where he'd found the metal box, then began measuring toward the direction marked in the sketch. It didn't take long to notice what Harper must have seen decades ago. The border didn't line up the way it should have. The rise of the ground, the shape of the ditch, even the stones that marked where his father used to say the old fence line once ran, none of it matched the boundaries on his deed. He stopped, crouching down, fingers brushing the soil. A dull unease crept through him. It wasn't the kind of mistake you'd make by plowing too far or by moving a fence post. It was deliberate, an inch or two here, a foot or two there, but stretched across the length of the field, it meant acres quietly stolen by time and paperwork. The sound of a distant truck rumbled along the highway, the noise fading as fast as it came. Eric stood and looked toward the horizon. He thought of Harper's notebook, the panic behind those rushed final lines. What if this wasn't just some old farmer's paranoia? What if he had been right, that someone had been watching him, taking what was his? He spent the next several hours marking the lines, making notes, and checking distances against the measurements from his father's old notebook, the one filled with rough sketches and hand-drawn plots from a time before computers tracked every inch of farmland. The measurements didn't lie. The border had shifted. Somewhere, somehow, the record of that shift had been made official, and Harper's land, whatever was left of it, had been swallowed into what was now called Johnson Grain and Storage. We're in that name again. The same one that appeared in the photocopied deeds inside the box. The same name Harper had mentioned in one of his letters, scrawled next to a line that said, "They'll take everything if I don't sign." Eric returned home late that afternoon, boots heavy with mud and head full of questions. His kitchen light cast a small yellow circle over the table as he laid the documents out once more. He picked up one of the old property transfer forms, flattening the creases, and studied the signature Walter Harper. It was written too carefully, the letters too even, like they'd been copied from something rather than written by a man under pressure. Beside it was a witness line, blank. Below that, a neat printed name, S. Johnson. He ran a thumb over the ink. The name wasn't foreign. Everyone in the county knew Sam Johnson. He owned the biggest elevator in 3 counties, loaned money to half the farms that were still standing, and had a smile that politicians borrowed during election seasons. Eric had shaken his hand once, years ago, at a county fair. Johnson's word carried weight. His money carried more. Eric's hands itched with the need to verify, to see for himself if this wasn't just some trick of coincidence. The next morning he drove into town, parked near the courthouse, and made his way to the county records office. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and dust. Rows of binders, faded typewritten forms, and property rolls filled the shelves like a history of quiet transactions. When he asked to see the records for the Harper property, the clerk, a gray-haired woman with half-moon glasses, pointed him to the microfilm machine. He fed the rolls one by one, the machine whirring as black-and-white scans of newspapers flickered across the screen. There it was, the story of the bank robbery. Local farmers suspected in disappearance of stolen funds. A grainy photograph showed Walter Harper's face. The article said he'd vanished after questioning, that police believed he'd fled with the money. Case unresolved. The next article, months later, mentioned a sheriff's auction of his land due to delinquent taxes. The buyer's name printed clearly at the bottom, Samuel Johnson. Eric leaned back in the squeaky chair, the paper ghosts glowing faintly on the machine's screen. It was all there, hiding in plain sight. Harper had been branded a thief, his land stripped and sold for nothing, and Johnson had profited quietly, rising from grain trader to a man whose face now smiled down from billboards that said Johnson Grain feeds America. On his way out, Eric stopped at the clerk's desk again. "You mind if I get a copy of this deed?" he asked. The woman nodded, running a copy through the machine. When she handed it over, she said softly, "Funny, isn't it? How the same names show up in those records decade after decade." Eric only nodded, folding the paper neatly and slipping it into his coat. That night, at home, he spread everything on the table again. Harper's papers, the deed copies, the news clippings, his own hand-scribbled notes. He drew a straight line across a clean page in his notebook, marking dates along it. 1978, the year of the robbery. 1979, Harper's disappearance. 1980, Johnson's land purchase. 1981, expansion of the grain elevator. The pattern was simple enough. Theft, disappearance, acquisition, success. He leaned over the table, staring at the pattern as if willing it to explain itself. Maybe it was coincidence, he told himself. Maybe Harper had stolen the money and run, and Johnson had just been the one to clean up the mess. But then there was the signature, the blank witness line, the frightened scrawl of that final diary entry. The more he looked, the less it felt like coincidence, and the more it looked like someone had written a script that the whole county had unknowingly followed for 40 years. He turned back to the rough map in Harper's notebook. The aspen line, the old well, the mark on the edge of the field. He had already dug once, and it had led him here. Every instinct told him that if there was one secret buried in that soil, there might be another, something Harper hadn't managed to dig up before they stopped him. The idea felt reckless, maybe even dangerous, but the longer he stared at those pages, the more it began to make sense. If the box had been hidden near the surface, maybe Harper had tried to leave a trail in pieces. The diary, the papers, a map to something he hadn't had time to reveal. Eric checked the weather through the window. Still gray, still cold. The light was fading fast, but he didn't want to wait for morning. He grabbed his gloves, a flashlight, and his shovel, the same one that had hit the box. The soil would be softer after the mist. He stepped out onto the porch and looked toward the dark silhouette of the field, the tree line waiting at the edge, like the edge of a secret. As he reached the old aspen line, his breath fogged in the cold. The beam of his flashlight caught on the damp ground, the rough texture of roots and stones. He measured out the distance marked in the sketch, then pushed the shovel into the dirt. The sound it made was the same dull thud as before. A few feet down, the blade scraped against something harder, something smooth and curved. He knelt, brushing the dirt away with his hands until the outline appeared. It wasn't rock. It wasn't metal either. He ran his fingers along it. The surface felt like bone. Eric froze. For a long time, he didn't move, didn't breathe. The wind shifted through the aspens behind him, making the branches clatter softly. He wanted to tell himself it was an animal, some old cow or deer long buried and forgotten. But when he brushed aside another handful of dirt, a shape emerged, a human skull, half intact, with a fragment of jaw still clinging to it. He sat back on his heels, staring at the hollow sockets, the streaks of soil across what had once been a face. The diary's last line echoed in his head. "If you found this, it means they buried me too." The cold seemed to seep straight through his jacket, through his skin. He stood slowly, the flashlight trembling in his grip. The earth around him looked no different than it had an hour ago, but now he could feel it watching him back. He thought of calling the sheriff, of reporting what he'd found, but then he remembered the name on those documents. Johnson, the man who loaned half the county money, the man whose influence reached into every office in town. Reporting this might mean giving the story back to the same people who had buried it in the first place. He turned off the flashlight and stood in the dark, heart beating hard. Somewhere under his boots lay the bones of a man who had tried to tell the truth. If Eric didn't handle this right, he'd end up buried with the same secret. He marked the spot carefully with a small stone and backed away, step by step, until the aspen line disappeared into shadow. He would come back tomorrow, he told himself, in daylight, with a plan. And for the first time in years, the soil beneath his land felt like something alive, full of questions that refused to stay silent. The night after Eric uncovered the skull was long and restless, filled with the kind of silence that presses against the walls of a house and waits for a man to make a choice. He sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, the documents and photographs spread out before him like pieces of a puzzle no one had finished. The diary lay open to the page he now knew was not metaphor, not fear, not confusion, just a man trying to leave proof before someone else buried both him and the truth. The words felt heavier now, weighted by the hollow stare of the skull that still sat beneath the soil. By dawn, Eric had made his decision. He was going back, not to cover the bones, not to ignore them, but to understand what they were connected to. He no longer believed the box had been buried by accident or panic. It had been placed there as the first thing someone might find. A warning. A door. If there was one burial, there could be more. If there were answers, they weren't in the courthouse or in the newspaper archive. They were in the ground itself, under decades of silence and rearranged ownership papers. He drove the tractor halfway across the field, leaving it parked like always, then walked the rest of the way to the aspen line. The light cut through the branches, pale and thin. The soil still showed the faint impression of his digging. He knelt beside the stone he'd used to mark the spot and began removing the dirt again, slowly, carefully this time, brushing the surface as if handling something fragile and final. Within minutes, the skull reappeared, followed by the curve of ribs, an arm bone twisted at an angle no living body would ever hold. The clothing had long disintegrated, but a belt buckle remained, fused to the soil by corrosion. Embedded in what was left of the fabric was a small oval of metal, darkened and unreadable until he rubbed the soil away. Letters emerged. W.H. Walter Harper hadn't fled. He hadn't run off with stolen money. He hadn't lived in hiding. He had died here exactly where the documents and signatures said he was still alive long enough to sign over his land. Someone had made sure no one ever came looking. Eric sat back on his heels again, staring at the bones in the cold air. The skull was missing its lower jaw as if it had been struck or broken. The ribs were dented inward. There were fractures in the arms that looked like they'd come from force, not decay. Harper hadn't simply died here. Someone had killed him. A sound rustled behind him, not from the aspens but from the ground a few feet away. Eric turned his head, and the shovel glinted where he had dropped it earlier. He stared at it a moment, then at the ground that ran along the border of the old map, the line marked with an X, not exactly where the skull was buried, but a little farther, near the edge of a shallow dip in the soil. The sketch in the diary hadn't been a single point. It had been a strip of land. Maybe Harper hadn't had the strength or time to finish digging what he meant to bury. Maybe one thing was meant to lead to the next. Eric stood and walked to the second marked area. The soil here was loose, not because of his own work, but because it had been disturbed once before. The earth had a way of forgetting over the years, but its surface still betrayed places where it had been cut and tamped back down. He dug again, deeper this time, peeling away layers of soil, roots, and stones until the shovel struck something that didn't sound like bone and didn't sound like earth. It wasn't metal the first time. It was something softer, something between wood and cloth, something tightly packed. He widened the hole and uncovered the edge of a large object wrapped in cracked canvas. He dug around it, prying loose the dirt that clung to its sides until the shape gave way beneath the shovel and slid forward enough for him to grip. It was heavy, the weight of it uneven inside, as if the contents were stacked or bundled. He pulled it free, dragging it onto the grass. The canvas was held by a leather strap that had long since dried into something brittle, but still unbroken. He worked it loose and then unwrapped the fabric, revealing a dark brown suitcase. The first thing that came out was the smell: old paper, damp leather, and time. The second was the sight bundles of cash, tied in aged twine, the print faded but not unfamiliar. Bills dated from the 70s, the kind banks no longer circulated, stacked in bundles thick enough to fill the base of the suitcase. He ran his fingers across the top bill, brushing off the dirt just enough to read the ink. The serial number began with the exact same prefix that he had copied from the newspaper archives the day before. This was the stolen money. Beneath the bundles lay a revolver, its metal darkened by years underground, but still visibly intact. The cylinder was loaded. The grip was worn by a hand that had once held it tightly. Beside it, folded paper part of a newspaper clipping with the words "Unsolved Robbery" still visible, and a torn map matching the one in Harper's diary, but marked with a second symbol. Not an X this time, but initials. S.J. Eric stared at the letters, his pulse loud in his ears. He didn't need a key, a document, or a sworn statement to understand what that meant. Someone with those initials had been close enough to Harper to leave a signature inside the suitcase. Someone who had gained land, money, and power after Harper's death. Someone who still lived in the county, still held influence, still loaned money to farmers hanging by a thread. Someone named Sam Johnson. Eric sat motionless, the wind blowing across the field as if trying to cover the hole back up. Now he understood why Harper never made it to the sheriff, why he hadn't written names directly in his diary, why the box and the map had been separated instead of buried together. Harper hadn't been leaving behind treasure. He had been leaving behind a case file, one he hoped someone would piece together when it was too late to silence him. Eric looked back toward his house across the field, a small shape against the empty land. The world suddenly felt divided into two parts. The part above ground, where neighbors waved and pretended the county was built on hard work and fair dealings, and the part below, where truth rotted with the bones of men no one missed. He covered the suitcase with a tarp and carried it back to the tractor. Not all of it. He left the gun buried for now, along with a few bundles sealed in the suitcase, like a locked reminder for himself. The rest he packed away, separating the bills into different bags, photographing serial numbers, and making notes in a new ledger he had never planned to keep. He wasn't thinking like a farmer anymore. He was thinking like a man holding evidence no one wanted found. By the time he reached the barn, the sky had begun to darken. He hid the suitcase under the loose boards beneath the workbench, using an old nail to mark the plank that would lift when needed. He sealed the diary and the documents in plastic, labeled them with quiet precision, and tucked them in a drawer where tools used to be kept. Every step felt irreversible. He walked back outside and stood in the field where the Scarecrow never got built, where the truth had been sleeping under the frost. He had expected the land to give him a harvest, to save him from losing everything. Instead, it had handed him the life of a dead man and a crime worth more than any crop. But crops died in a season. Secrets could last a lifetime. And now, whether he wanted it or not, Eric Miller was holding both. The days that followed felt quieter, but not in a peaceful way. The silence on the farm had changed into something watchful, like the cold air itself was waiting to see what Eric would do next. He moved through his chores the same as always, feeding the chickens, checking the frost line in the barn, repairing the broken hinge on the shed door, but everything he touched now felt temporary. The fence he fixed, the hay he stacked, the bills he still couldn't pay. None of it seemed as real as the stack of documents and photographs now hidden in the drawer beneath his father's old wrench set, or the suitcase locked beneath the floorboards. The weight of those objects didn't decrease with distance or hours. They stayed with him, tugging at his thoughts like a buried hook. Every evening, after the day's work left his hands raw and his back aching, he returned to the kitchen table to study what he had gathered. He organized everything into folders the way he imagined detectives might. One for land documents, one for money and bank evidence, one for physical proof like the belt tag, map fragments, and photographs of the bones. He wrote notes in the margins of notebook pages, drew arrows between names, added dates in neat print so he could see the pattern forming in front of him. 1978, robbery. 1979, Harper disappears. 1980 land purchased by Johnson. 1981, expansion of grain business. 1982, onward. Johnson becomes the man no one in the county can afford to disagree with. Eric kept trying to convince himself that he had no reason to get involved. This wasn't his fight. He hadn't known Walter Harper. He hadn't been alive when the robbery happened. He didn't stand to gain anything by dragging the past into the light. No reward, no victory, nothing but danger. But something in him had already crossed a point he couldn't return from the moment he uncovered the skull. Once you look into the eyes of a dead man and know he didn't get his own story told, it's hard to pretend it isn't your concern. One night, he set up a lamp over the table and studied the signatures again. The name Walter Harper appeared on 3 different documents written months apart, one on the deed, one on a transfer form, one on a tax release. But the handwriting was wrong. Not wildly different, just unnaturally perfectly similar. Each loop, each slant, each flick of the pen fell in the same place, like someone had practiced tracing it until imitation became repetition. A real signature changed. A hand tense with fear or age or anger couldn't make the exact same line twice, let alone 3 times. This was not a man signing while under pressure. This was a man's name forged by someone who needed his presence, not his body. Eric held the signatures up to the light, using a sheet of thin tracing paper to overlay them. When the duplicates lined up exactly, he felt a heaviness rise in his chest. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was proof. Someone had signed Harper's life away after he was already dead. The next day, he drove into town again, not to speak to anyone, but to copy more records. This time, he made sure there were no patterns in his behavior. Different parking spot, different aisle in the store before heading to the courthouse, a detour through the hardware section before walking out with nothing but a receipt for twine. He didn't know if he was being cautious or paranoid, but caution seemed like the only thing standing between him and whatever fate had met Harper. Back at the courthouse, he stayed longer than before, poring through old newspaper archives and county sales notices. Every mention of Johnson's name in the early years was attached to growth purchases, business expansions, grain silos, storage contracts, none of it illegal on paper. But everything timed perfectly with one man's disappearance and one set of land records that changed hands under circumstances no one questioned because no one wanted to. When he got home that night, the sky was already dark, and the wind had picked up. The house felt colder than it should have. He flicked the porch light on and stared across the field, the far line of trees barely visible in the distance. He went to the barn and checked the plank hiding the suitcase, still untouched, but the feeling in the air wasn't paranoia. It was presence. Someone had been near his land recently. He could feel it as surely as he could feel rain coming through his knees before he ever saw clouds. So he began doing what only men who have no choice do. He prepared for the truth to be stolen or silenced before it could be told. He created 3 copies of the dossier, each containing photographs of the bones, the suitcase, the money, the deeds, the forged signatures, and the timeline he had built. One copy he locked in a metal toolbox lined with old grease rags and placed behind the feed sacks in the barn. Another copy he hid beneath the tractor seat in a waterproof pouch, using the bolts and dust to disguise it as part of the machine. The third copy he drove 2 towns over and locked in a safe deposit box under a different name, paying cash. If someone found one, the others would live. He also began leaving signs for himself in the soil. At the far entrance to the field, the one no one used unless they meant to sneak in, he spread a thin line of sand mixed with tiny shards of glass. The next morning the pattern was broken, not by boots, but by tires. Fresh tracks, a different brand than his. The tread marked wider grooves than his tractor or truck. Someone had come close, pulled in, turned around, and left. Not a visitor, not a neighbor, a watcher. That night he sat at the table and stared at the revolver from the suitcase. It lay on the towel like something caught between worlds, old enough to belong to a dead man, dangerous enough to belong to a living one. He didn't load it, he didn't clean it, but he kept it near. By now he understood something clearly. Whoever had taken Harper's land hadn't just needed to hide a crime. They had built a life on it, money, power, reputation. And anyone who tried to pull the bones back out of the soil would be digging at the foundations of a man who had made sure no one ever questioned how he rose to the top. Eric was no detective, no lawyer, no crusader. He was just a farmer who happened to hit the wrong patch of ground at the wrong time. But the moment he uncovered what was meant to stay buried, it stopped being wrong time and became wrong man to expect silence from. Wrong man to hope would walk away. He sat back from the table, rubbing his face, thinking of his father and grandfather, of the land they tended and respected, the land that now held the evidence of a murder no one ever named. He knew now that the earth didn't just keep seed and harvest, it kept truth too. Truth that waited, truth that punished the ones who assumed time would erase it. Tomorrow he would do what Harper never had the chance to do. He would begin making sure the truth no longer needed a grave. And when that happened, silence would no longer be an option for anyone, not him, not Johnson, not the county that had lived off a lie for 40 years. But doing it right meant doing it carefully, and doing it carefully meant doing it alone. By the time the first week of December settled over the land, the air had turned sharp enough to sting the lungs, and the fields were painted in brittle frost that clung to every stem and fence post. The farm looked quiet, like any other piece of rural America preparing to sleep through winter. But Eric knew better. The silence wasn't rest anymore. It was tension, covered by snow and distance. Inside the house, the folders lay stacked on the kitchen table, 3 filled with everything he had learned, and 1 left open, pages fanned out like a truth rehearsing its own testimony. The copies he had made were clean, organized, undeniable. Photographs of the bones, the tag with WH on it, the map fragments, the suitcase full of stolen money, the serial numbers matching the robbery, the land transfer records, the forged signatures, the timeline of Johnson's rise. No single page could shatter a man like Sam Johnson, but together they could cut through the lie that had lived longer than the man it buried. Eric stood over the table and looked at what he had become keeper of, Not a treasure, not leverage, not a chance to save his farm. A reckoning. Something that didn't belong to him but had chosen him all the same, simply because he was the first person in 40 years who hadn't walked past the truth when it was staring out of the ground. He sealed the first envelope, the one with the photographs and the copies of the deeds, addressed to a woman named Evelyn Harper in Missouri, the granddaughter of the man in the dirt. He didn't know if she ever wondered what happened to her grandfather, or if the story had been told so many times she no longer questioned it. But now she would know. He added no note, no explanation, just the evidence that her grandfather had not been the thief the county had named him. The second envelope went to the state attorney general's office. He added a cover letter this time, typed single-spaced, unsigned, citing suspected land fraud, homicide, and evidence tied to an unsolved federal robbery case. Nothing emotional, nothing personal, just facts and attached proof, because truth didn't need speeches. The third went to an investigative journalist he had chosen carefully, one who didn't write for a small-town newspaper owned by people who owed Johnson favors. This one worked for a state paper that didn't depend on grain elevator contracts or farm subsidies. Eric included only one sentence in that envelope. Read carefully and do not trust the county sheriff. The fourth packet was the one he hesitated over. It went to a large insurance company, the one responsible for evaluating and underwriting the policies on Johnson's grain facility. The folder included only financial documents, the signatures, the timeline, the evidence that Johnson's expansion was funded with stolen cash and fraudulent land acquisition. No mention of bones, no mention of a corpse, just the kind of information that made rich institutions panic. Truth didn't only matter to law and bloodlines, it mattered to liability and risk. He loaded all 4 envelopes into his truck, drove 2 towns over, and mailed them from different post offices, never letting himself use the same road twice. He didn't speak to anyone, he didn't linger, he didn't wait to see if anyone watched him. He had already accepted that if someone was watching, they already knew. He didn't need to look over his shoulder to confirm what he felt in the soil near the fence line, in the shifting sand by the gate, in the fresh tire marks that appeared and vanished with the weather. When he drove home, he didn't go straight to the house. He walked back out to the field again and stared at the place where the ground now held 2 things, what had been buried and what had been uncovered. The cross he placed over Harper's bones was simple. Just 2 planks he had sanded smooth, sunk deep, and left unmarked. He didn't want to claim the land as a grave. He wanted it to be a boundary, a line between before and after. He stood there a long time, hat in his hands, not because he prayed, but because he understood farms better than people. A field didn't care who planted it or who inherited it. It didn't remember ownership, but it never forgot what went into it. It wasn't spiteful, it was patient. It held everything until someone dug with the right question. The next morning, the calls began, not to him, but around him. People in town talked. Something about a state investigation, something about old land records being pulled, something about attorneys showing up at the courthouse. There were rumors of reporters making calls about a farmer named Harper and an old bank robbery. No one connected it to Eric. Not yet. 2 days later, the sheriff's cruiser came slowly down his road, but it didn't turn into his driveway. It paused at the turn, then rolled on. A warning, a reminder. Someone already knew the story was spreading. Someone had already begun to feel something cracking beneath their feet. The bank that had been threatening to take his land called him that same week, but this time the voice was different, cautious, even polite. There had been a change in administrative status, with certain loan accounts connected to Johnson's financing network. The man on the phone said phrases like temporary hold and review status. He didn't say the word fear, but Eric could feel it between the lines. That evening, Eric received a different call from another lender, a cooperative 1 county over. They had heard the grain market might be reorganizing, and they were willing to discuss alternative loan terms if he was interested. The world had not changed overnight, but its balance had shifted. The man who once held every debt and every silence in his fist had finally been forced to loosen his grip. Eric hung up the phone and stood by the window, watching the last light fade across his land. Nothing miraculous had happened. No celebration. No justice handed down from the sky. Nothing about the farm was saved yet. He still had to fight for every inch. But now he was fighting in a world where the lie that had powered another man's fortune was finally cracking open, exposed not by force or law, but by truth too loud to bury a second time. He walked out to the barn and opened the drawer where the box used to be. The space was empty now. He didn't need the papers anymore. They were already gone, already moving through offices and hands and newsrooms. The truth no longer belonged to him, and that was the point. Truth wasn't meant to be owned, only carried long enough to be released. Outside, the stars were faint through the winter haze. The Scarecrow he had never finished building still leaned against the barn wall, stuffed with straw he no longer needed to protect. The birds could take the rest of the corn. The land had already given him something more valuable than a crop. It had given him a voice he never expected to have, and a duty he never asked for, but could not walk away from. He closed the barn door, hung the lantern on its hook, and stood for a moment listening to the wind move across the open fields. It no longer felt like the land was holding its breath. It felt like it was exhaling for the first time in decades. Eric walked back toward the house, slower than before, but lighter. There were no guarantees, no promises, not even safety. Only one certainty. What was buried was no longer silent. And whatever came next, it would not come from the ground, but from the world now forced to face what the ground had protected. The truth was no longer his to keep. It was out there now. It had been released, and once released, truth did not go back into the earth. It traveled. It grew. It lived. Just like a seed. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. There are more twists, more mysteries, and more real-life drama coming your way. And hey, share this video with someone who loves a good story. You never know who might get hooked.